Hello and welcome to the Paranormalist Podcast. I'm your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you this day?
I am doing just fine. It's a beautiful day. I think it's in the mid 80s. It's August. So there's nothing to complain about. It's those lazy, hazy last summer days coming up
hmm
and just had a, peaceful weekend.
Good. Yeah, I turned my head to, my windows are over here, and then I can see that the light's coming in from outside. But I've been inside for a little bit today. I did have to do some running around, but we would like to thank everyone who is joining us for the first time. Please do consider clicking the subscribe and the like. Click that bell so you'll get notified. And everything about the Paranormalist podcast will be in the description, our Facebook groups and email address, and we will accept your feedback. And Patty's going to have something to say about a little feedback here as soon as I finish my little spiel. And I'm going to ask what the topic is, but she's going to talk first and then tell us what our topic is. But with that, I think I'm done talking.
Okay.
Mhm.
So we had somebody ask if I was an AI, and I assure you I am mortal to the core. Definitely not as confident that I can make things happen as AI seems to be. But I've just been doing this a long time, so my pathway through history and the paranormal is kind of rich. And I've been doing, if people haven't noticed, I've been doing more of a scripted version to make sure that I can give you better storytelling as I'll get into places where I'm maybe not as proficient. I spend a lot more time reading and then creating a story. And maybe at some point in the future, we'll put together a book of some of these stories to share with all of you. But for the person who asked about the AI, I am not. So today we're going to visit part 2 of The Walking Dead men. And then we're going to move on from that next week to something else. I'm not allowed to tell you, but I promise you it's unusual. If you think that you've heard folklore and history, wait until you find these stories, because these stories start in like the Middle Ages. I'm talking about like the 1500s, some of these stories. And then they have modern versions using the same magic.
All right. That's
So
going to be next week, though, right?
yep,
Yeah.
that's next week.
Mhm.
So right now we're going to go
Okay.
visit some of these. Now, for those who didn't listen to last week's podcast, Dead Man Walking has become a famous term based on the idea of people on death row walking their last walk to the execution chamber or what have you. And um, long before that, however, they were a category of haunting. There's all kinds of different types of hauntings. So Dead Man Walking. So these are usually stories of people, males or females, who are seen within a very short window of time after their death. They're usually in transit to some place, usually their home or their job or something that was a very important part of their life. And so we're going to visit some more of these stories. I literally found hundreds of these stories. And if you had listened to last week, we talked about the SPR, which is a spirit research organization, that was spiritual organization that existed in the 1700s and forward. There are still, I believe, branches of it out there today, although they've been supplanted by the multitudinous amounts of paranormal groups that now exist, although those are coming down a little bit.
Hmm.
The pandemic seemed to slow that whole process. But we're going to start talking about some of them. So our first story is going to be in the 1890s in Scotland. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Scotland. I know I haven't, but
Mhm.
I've
Mhm.
done a lot of there's a couple
Mm.
TV shows I watch where they build houses and what have you in Scotland, and the moors are just such a flat stretch of ground, like you looks like you could see forever. The story takes place in the winter months. The sky is gray. It's just a miserable, kind of cold, bitter day. The moors of the
I'm sorry, sky is gray in summer too.
is it? Have you been there?
Yes. Yeah.
That's
Mhm.
cool. Well, I
Mhm.
mean, it does look beautiful though. I'd love to go see it someday.
Yeah. Mhm. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, I had to say that. Yeah.
Nope, you never interrupt. We enjoy
Uh,
having it.
uh,
So, yeah, so we'll start our story here. The moors of the Highlands stretch wide and wind-bitten, a place where a man's silhouette can be recognized from half a mile away. The shepherd in this story, the story is known as the Scottish Shepherd of the Moor Path. The shepherd in this story died of exposure in a sudden storm. His name is only preserved in the records of the SPR as JM. They did not give his actual name, just his initials. His co-workers remembered him as a quiet man with a slight limp from an old injury, and the storm came fast, rolling across the hills with sleet, sharp wind, and it was so cold that it cut your breath off in your lungs. He never made it back to the bothy, which would have been a place where he could get shelter. The next morning, before um, when they gathered together for work, they realized he never made it home either. So they set out on a hunting party to see if they could find him. His wife did not know that he had him holed up somewhere else, so she was still hopeful. At that moment, nobody had come to tell her any different. So the search party was looking for him, and just around the time it seems they found his body. His wife saw him also walking across the moor path that he always took to him. He was walking slow, she would tell the researchers, with that steady gait of his, that little bit of a limp like he always did. She recognized him instantly as he moved along the path. He walked right past her as she went down to the gate to meet him. And as she stood there, she called his name. He turned, he looked at her, and then he simply blinked away. She told the SPR interviewer that she felt no fear or shock, only that she knew that this was the last time she would ever see him. Although the facts don't offer much meat for conjecture, this gentleman who worked the Highlands as a shepherd was seen for 3 more days moving down the path every evening. He would walk it every morning as though he were going to work. This case caught the eye of the SPR because it was unusual. There was multiple witnesses for that 3-day period, and neighbors actually saw him as well. So that aligned with what they were looking for at the time in this investigation. And it's, to me, it's kind of sad that he was dead for 3 days and trying to either get to work or home. You know what I mean?
mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, that he never could get
Mhm.
whatever it is that made him restless. It just seems like a sort of sad story in a strange way. Our next one is from Ontario, Canada. This took place in about 1910. Now, trapping was a really big part of the Canadian economy, much as it was part of the economy for the United States early on in the 17 and 1800s. By the early 1900s, it was beginning to lose steam, but there were still a lot of people making their living that way. There's still a few to this day that do. But in order to run a trap line, you have to be able to go out in the bad weather and walk miles and miles looking to see if anything's been captured in your traps, reset your traps. Then you have the carcasses to take care of and the skins to separate from the carcass. So it's a really cold and solitary work. The trapper in his story died of exposure because he got lost in a blizzard. He and his brother were working a trap line, and they lived in a log cabin along a winter road on one side with a creek running by on the other. Now, his brother had no idea he had died. They'd both been throughout the years captured into the winter by blizzards and what have you. They'd put up somewhere, and a day or two later, they'd wander in. There's no reason his brother would have thought anything different that night. But as his brother went out to gather wood to batten down the hatches for the night, just in case, his brother came, he took a kind of look around, and that's when he saw him. It was just about dusk, and he decided he'd walk down towards the water to see if there was any mink or any muskrat or something that had caught in those lines. As the brother was walking down there, he saw his brother, whom he thought was hunkered down somewhere, and he was just walking along carrying his gear, the long, steady strides of somebody walking in snow that they've learned how to walk, with those snowshoes and what have you. Man called out to his brother thinking that he was on his way home, and he yelled, I've got a pot of beans cooking and the fire crackling. I'll be in a minute. The figure kept on going down the little road beside the cabin, but nothing came out on the other side. So he turned around, he finished his job of checking the traps, and he came back in. There was nobody in the cabin. There was nobody who had left the snowshoe prints, not only on the road, which had not been traversed for several days because of the bad weather, but not even at the door. No snowshoes, no prints, nothing disturbed. The brother walked inside, really puzzled. He had seen him clear as day. His brother hadn't looked up, but that's not unusual when you're out in that cold and you're tired and exhausted. You just want to get inside. When his brother didn't come the next morning, he decided he was going to walk to town and see if he could get help. They found his brother laying up against a tree, covered with snow up past his waist. For some reason, he hadn't been able to find shelter, and it was estimated he had probably been long dead by the time he had walked past the cabin and on to whatever it is he was supposed to go on to. In Tennessee, in 1910, a widow was waiting for her son. He was coming down out of the Appalachian foothills from one of the churches up on the mountain. He had been on his way home and had told his mom before he left that morning he was going to stop at the church after he finished logging. He worked for a logger who took a whole team of horses and 5 good men up into those mountains every day to cut out the big old trees. But on the way home, he planned to stop at the church and see about repairs that needed to be done. So he was going to separate from the wagon when he got close to the church. When the wagon came rattling by the house and he wasn't on it, she wasn't surprised at all. That was exactly the plan. So she thought he would, finish walking down out there by himself. He'd be a little late. She finished up supper and she sat it on the back of the stove. He still didn't come, and she went out and sat on the porch. Now anxiety was beginning to get the best of her. She walked back and forth on the porch, went down to the gate, came back up a couple times, sat down and waited for him. Dusk started to creep in, and that's when she saw the movement in the distance. It was somebody walking, head down, and then she looked at him closer. He moved with that familiar gait. If you ever watched your kids walk or something, you know them from a distance. She thought, surely that's my son. And then, no, maybe not. And then again, but then as he got closer, she could see him. The same jacket he wore in the morning, the same hat slouched down over his face. As he got close to the gate, right at the edge of the road, he paused for a moment. He looked up and smiled at his mom. He turned around and went back the way he was going, headed up the path to the church. It said that he walked for a couple nights. The first night only his ma saw him, but the second night, several of his siblings were sitting on the porch comforting her because his body had been found up at the edge of the church. He had been accosted and killed and robbed. Everything she said about how he was dressed, the way he was moving, the fact that the pack that he usually slung on the side of his shoulder was missing, was all part of what they found when they got him. The pack was missing. He definitely looked like he had been robbed. He had been roughed up, struck, and then shot. In Indiana, there was a railroad worker on the track bed. This is a story from 1920s. The railroad men in the Midwest walked the track beds daily, their boots crunching on the gravel, their silhouettes familiar to anybody who lived near the line. The worker in the story died in an accident when they were switching lines for engines. His funeral was held the next day, and his family returned home in the late afternoon. So my father was a line walker when he was a young man. And basically, we walked 12 to 15, 18 miles. You marked any place that needed any kind of repairs on the line so the trains wouldn't jackknife off of the tracks. And that's what he did for about 7 years of his life. You can imagine he was quite a strong walker. And then wherever you stopped for the day, you bed down, you made a little fire, you ate something. The next day you did it again. Long about Friday, you waved down a train and it took you in the right direction to get you home again. But for this fella, it didn't quite work that way. At dawn the morning after he had left for his walk, which would have been about a week long, everybody's walked the lines Monday through Friday or Saturday, and then they'd be home for a couple days. Two neighbors were walking to the station to report seeing somebody walking along the track. They thought it was him, but it didn't make sense because he should have been a lot further along than he was. One said, I followed this fella. He walked ahead of us, same as always. And they said they recognized his distinctive stride, a long, lean walking stride for years of railroad work. They called out thinking that he might pause and they could all walk together. When he got to they got to the station and explained all this, the railroad station master looked at them puzzled, and he said to them, boys, didn't you hear? He got crushed when a train was switching yesterday afternoon. He couldn't have been walking the lines with you. The men were totally shocked, but it was not the first time that people would see him. That would later come out, and it wouldn't be the last. He'd walked the line for about a week, and after that, he just disappeared. He never went back to his home, as many of these people do, just walked the line and then disappeared. And all over the country, there are stories of stuff like that. In Wyoming, there was a rancher in the 1940s that I'd like to tell you a little bit about. The ranch lands of Wyoming stretch wide and are carved by the wind, with fences running like stitched seams across the prairie. The rancher in this story died of a sudden heart attack while working alone on his land. One neighbor saw him working who had not yet heard the story that his body had been found. They had been repairing a section of fence when they saw him walking the line of fencing in their direction. The neighbor called out later and said, hey, I just saw Fred walking down the fence line. And then a couple seconds later, he was gone to a Confederate of his who was helping him on his fence lines. The fellow said, yeah, I saw him too. They went home that night, not expecting anything odd, but by morning, the story had spread that Fred had been found. He had been laying dead in the field where his heart had stopped. Something about the story didn't make sense to those two men. They said it happened in the morning, that he had been found about 10 a.m., and yet at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, as they were sweating and trying to finish up stretching out new barbed wire lines across the edge of a field, they had seen him walking as though he were headed back home. Maybe he was, although nobody in his house ever reported seeing him. These two men were completely convinced that what they saw was real. In the 1930s in rural Georgia, schoolhouses were usually set up at the edge of the road, usually long old dirt roads lined by pine trees. And the teachers who taught there, well, they weren't teachers like we think of them today. They were young men or women, mostly single, who took the job for some time. They were teaching 8 grades at one time. And there was a story about a young teacher who would often hitch a ride on her way home with one of the local men who would stop and pick her up and then drop her off at her little cabin where she lived. The students one day, however, had an interesting story to tell. The story goes like this. One afternoon, the fellow who picked her up on the wagon picked her up as he always did. She was extremely quiet, not chatty like she often was. And on this journey, she just sat very quietly. He thought she looked like she was perplexed or something was bothering her. So he clucked at the horses and sped them along so she could get out. When they got to the place where she lived, normally he stepped down and handed her down out of the wagon. On this instance, he didn't have a chance. She jumped down, still holding on to the leather bag that she carried her school supplies in. She turned and she walked away, and she didn't even say thank you, which was very unlike this lady. Well, he went home that night and, had supper with his family and what have you. And the next morning, he went about his morning, and about 10 o'clock in the morning, he saw two of his sons walking past the mill where he worked, and he yelled out to the boys, "What's going on, boys? Why aren't you in school?" And the boys came over and said, "Pa, we can't be in school on account of the teacher was dead." He said, "What do you mean the teacher's dead? She's just a young girl." They said, "Well, she was found not far from the school and somebody had murdered her. We'll just leave it at that. And she must have been there all night from what they said. We found her this morning. Well, not us, but a couple of the other kids, the older boys." It's like, that's crazy. So he went down to talk to the sheriff and tell the sheriff that there's got to be something off about this story, because he literally, picked her up last night and took her home like he often did at the end of the day. And the sheriff was like, "Are you serious? We know for a fact she had to have been killed right after school. She was laying there on the ground, and laying there right beside her was that old satchel of hers. She was still wearing the same outfit she'd been wearing when the kids had seen her the day before." Well, that would have been something, just to tell you the story that way. Except for about 4 or 5 days in a row afterward, that fella going home took the wagon and headed out that path like he did every day, only to see her standing in the distance as though she was waiting for a ride. He hitched the horses fast and clicked at them to move, and they trotted right on by her. She looked scared, alone. He felt mighty sorry, but knowing her condition, not being alive and all, he figured that the good Lord needed to take care of this because it was way beyond his pay grade. So he said a lot of prayers for her, but that was as far as it could go. He would tell the story a couple times, and a couple other people came forward to say they had also seen her on that road. But after 3 or 4 days, she no longer appeared. And everybody hoped, and I hope for her too, that she found whatever peace she needed. In Nova Scotia, there was a lighthouse keeper in the 1910s that had a sad and strange story to tell. Now, lighthouse keepers often lived really close to danger. Their paths were along winding cliffs where the wind and the sea met. One day, this particular lighthouse keeper that we're going to talk about, he was out working with a couple other lighthouse keepers. They usually had a staff of about 3, so somebody could sleep and somebody could do the house chores and somebody could keep the light going, because that was a full-time occupation and they needed more than one person out there to do the lights. So they were all about their chores, doing what they normally did, when a storm blew in. Everybody came scurrying up to the lighthouse, hurried inside. This fella still had on his rain slicker. And his buddies were teasing him about, "You might as well take it off. We're not going out in that weather." The guy sat down quietly in the corner, and he just sat there. And they thought, well, maybe he's frustrated or angry about something. I don't know. He seemed off in some way. So the fellow whose job it was to go and make sure the light was up and running went up the stairs quickly and started the process, because with that wild storm and darkness falling, it would be imperative that the ship captains be able to see that light so they could steer clear of those cliffs and bottoming out and tearing up the boats and possibly killing a lot of people. The other fellow started making supper and tried to make some small talk, but he didn't respond. He seemed morose, engrossed in some thought. Finally, the fellow said, "Look, if you don't want to talk, I'll just sit here myself and eat my dinner." And he yelled up the steps that there was dinner ready, and the other fellow yelled, "I'll be down when I can." But the fellow that had the rain slicker on, why, he didn't move. His buddy took over a bowl of stew and sat it down beside him, and he said, "I guess you're bothered about something, but when you're hungry enough, you'll eat." But He didn't. He looked up at his friend, bewildered, and then just faded away. The guy yelled, and the fella from the upstairs watching the light going came running down to see what had happened. He told his story, and come daylight, they both went out looking. Well, the fellow that had the slicker on had been walking up along those cliffs, kind of getting a measure of the weather, watching things to see if they should start working on getting that light moving, because it didn't run all the time. In the daytime, they didn't really need it. You could see it unless it was bad weather or darkness. They didn't have to have it on every moment of the day. He must have stumbled. He said the ground gave way under his foot, and he fell off one of those sheer ledges and ended up down near the edge of the water. So whatever happened, whoever it was sitting there, he wasn't a live man at all, just the phantom. Dead man walking, heading home. He still knew that light needed tended, and I guess he wasn't ready to let it go yet. And most of the stories we've talked about are men, but this one's different. This one took place in Ireland in the 1880s. Now, today we talk about washerwomen, and it sounds something exotic and from a distant time in the past, but there were women who made their living by washing the laundry of well-to-do folks. They were the washerwomen. And that's what they did. They take the clothing out to a creek and wash them, hang them out on the bushes to dry, and then fold them up and take them back and collect whatever, a few pennies or pences or whatever their form of payment was. There was this particular washerwoman who would walk along the edge of this one river, and she would carry baskets of wet clothes along the narrow path, taking them down to a little meadow where there was a nice place to hang the clothing on the bushes and the shrubs and laying them out over the briars so that they would dry easily. And as the story goes, she was walking along. It was rainy, it was wet, she was miserably cold and damp. The laundry was heavy because it had not only been sodden in the water, she had washed it, but also now it was soaking up more water as she walked along because of the torrential downpour that was coming. At that point, she decided to cross the river at a spot she had crossed it probably 100 times to get over to the other side where the meadow was, and she could go from there to her home. She stepped out into the river, and it was at that moment that she realized she had made a mistake. The river was running a bit high because it had been raining off and on, but it was running awful high this particular afternoon. And as she stepped in, her foot went down further than she ever anticipated. She felt the rocks shift under her, and she drowned. Now, nobody knew right away. Of course, it took a while. Her body went down under the water, moved downstream a ways. Don't know what happened to the basket of laundry, but I imagine it just sunk right where it was. Late that afternoon, when the sky had finally cleared, one of the neighbors was out walking whenever they saw her coming up from the river. She was moving quick, like she always did. She always seemed to be in a hurry. She had on a shawl. It was a bright pattern shawl that she was very proud of, and she wore it almost all the time. But what caught his eye was that she didn't have her basket. Either full or empty, that basket was in her arms almost every time he saw her. And he called out to her and asked her, "Did you drop your basket, lady?" As if to make a joke. She looked up, she pulled the shawl closer, and he realized she was soaking wet. The look on her face was sad, tired, he said. Nothing to be afraid of. But as he got a bit closer, he yelled out, "Are you doing okay?" She stopped, she lifted her head one last time, and then she simply vanished. It would be about a day and a half later that her body would surface, a couple little villages away. Word spread, and finally somebody from their village rode down to take a look because she'd been missing. And sure enough, he was able to identify her. The shawl was wrapped around her. He could make out her features still. The truth is, we don't know exactly when it happened, but it must have happened earlier during the downpour because the river went down fairly quickly afterward. And that is the story. She was still walking, headed home, but maybe she was out looking for her basket because the washerwoman without a basket couldn't make an income. In Wales in the 1870s, there was a farmhand on a place called Hill Road. Now, he had worked that road on that road for years. He had lived at the same farm, worked for the same farmer. Life was pretty much the same every day. He'd walk down the road a ways, about 4 or 5 miles, as the crow flies, turn down a dirt lane, and then go to the farm. Now, he carried with him a box over his shoulder, had a leather strap over his shoulder, and it was his tools that he would use. He would fix things, repair fences, do things like that. And when he didn't have any other work, he'd help with the scying or the mowing or the stacking of the hay or what have you. But every day he took the box of tools with him just in case, and he carried it that whole time. On this particular day, he had been asked to go out to the fields to work. There was no fixing to be done. So he sat his box at the edge of the field and stepped up into the hayfield with his rest of the crew. They cut hay, piled it up. He sat off in a cart filled with the hay to take it to the barn. He was to come back and to pick up the next load. When some time went by and he didn't come back, the farmer got angry because he was paying good money for this. He told the other hands to keep working, and he walked up to the farm where he found that the horse had started and pulled the wagon and run him over, and he was dead, laying there on the ground outside the edge of the barn. Absolutely in shock, he ran down to the field and told the hands to hurry up. He sent somebody to town to get the priest in case there was any last rites to be said, and to get the police as well because something bad had happened. One fella took off running. The other fellas came piling in. They hitched the horse and moved the wagon, and sure enough, their friend was dead. For several days afterward, they saw this fella early in the day walking down, headed toward the fields and the farm. Several folks saw him, not just the hands, not just the farmer, but other folks who knew him from the village. He had his hat clapped to his head, and he was humming a tune like he did in life. And this went on for nearly a week. Only a few minutes every day, but if you were in the right place on that road, you would definitely have seen him. Then, just as he had appeared out of nowhere, he would just suddenly disappear right in front of the watchers. There's a lot of stories of things like this, things that happen that we don't know how to explain. Last week, I told you guys a couple stories of the reasons that I believe these stories are a part of the fabric of life forever. Things that happened in my own world that I can't explain. And the truth is, ghosts and hauntings are as old as mankind. One of the first types of stories that ever came out were stories of the dead restless and walking. I can't tell you I've seen them myself, but I can tell you that there have been people recording them, reporting them, experiencing them forever. I'll leave you with one last story. In Kentucky, there was a midwife in the 1920s who took her job quite seriously. She'd be sent mostly whenever women were about to give birth, but sometimes for other reasons as well. If someone took ill and they needed a potion or a medicine, she was about as close to a doctor as those mountains could provide at that time. So it was nothing for her to get rousted out of bed at 2 a.m. or early in the morning at 3 or 4, and she'd grab her satchel filled with whatever she needed, and she'd head out. She was a dedicated woman, and she was fairly old, but that didn't seem to stop her. Even if she had to pause to catch her breath multiple times, she carried that satchel in one hand and her walking stick in the other, and she kept moving. She had purpose as though she felt like she had to hurry. Now, the story goes that one night, in the middle of the night, a man came a calling. He was in an awful lather. His wife was birthing their child, and he thought something was going wrong. He needed help. He was way out of his depth. She grabbed up her satchel and her walking stick, pulled on her old boots, and she followed him out. He had a lantern, and he was hard pressed to be slow enough to keep beside her. He wanted her to hurry so badly, but he got her to the house. She stepped inside, and it took only a couple moments to realize what is going on. That baby was coming breech, and that meant that baby might not come at all. It could kill both the baby and the mom. And she sat too, trying to turn the child, trying to ease the mom's mind, told his husband to go and get pans of water. She's working all through the night, sweat running down her face, trying to calm the girl. This was her second birth, and she was wild with fear because the pain was immense and there wasn't anything the midwife could do. She worked all night, and early in the morning hours, she said to the husband, "You need to hold her hand and just sit there a while. I'm going to have to take a rest." The midwife was exhausted. She sat down in a chair in the room, watching the girl. The girl had fallen asleep, which was a blessing. The man just stared like somebody haunted. And in that room, in the darkness, the midwife closed her eyes, for she was more tired than she had ever been. She never opened them again. She died in that room. I wish I could tell you what happened to the girl who was given birth, but the record doesn't tell me that. What it does tell me is that that evening, there were two sisters walking home from their aunt's house to their mother's, and they saw the midwife hurrying along as if she had purpose. She had that satchel in her hand and her walking stick in the other, and she was moving fast for an old lady. One of them called out, "Who's about to give birth, Goody?" The woman didn't answer. And the other one said, "Well, I never. Goody, who's going to give birth?" Now, Goody was a name for an older lady or somebody who did nursing. She was Goody, or good wife. The woman stopped and she turned around, her eyes piercing. It was only beginning to get dark late in the afternoon, and they could see her quite clearly. They recognized her bonnet, her clothing, her shawl, everything about her. And the woman gave a huff. They didn't hear it, they could just see it. She pushed past them and kept on moving. And just before she hit the turn, the woman turned and paused and looked back one last time and simply faded away. They couldn't explain it. They had no idea what had happened, but they got home and they told their mom because they were really ruffled. Well, unfortunately, their mom had heard the story that the good midwife had died the night before in the birthing room for that young woman. She told the girls they were being liars and that they shouldn't say terrible things like that. This was a tragedy. Somebody had died. The girls were afraid and affronted by the entire thing because they clearly saw this woman. It would be a couple more days before the stories came from other folks, but they came of the midwife hurrying down the way as if she was going to a birthing. Now, this went on for 2 days, off and on. And then she finally, hopefully, found her peace. Stories like this, stories of these apparitions, are one of the clearest crisis apparitions known in the paranormal community. It's not a ghost story in the theatrical sense, the way they usually are. It's a moment of recognition on a narrow ridge road, a preserved memory of watching your son walk down the ridge, or a midwife hurrying to her business. The story still is alive in that area, still told from time to time, not because she's seen, but because it's such a part of the fabric of that community that she'll be long remembered for both her good and her haunting. With that, I'm going to wish you all a good evening.